They'd cast lots and the loser would be beaten to death by the other 9. Ask Reddit on Reddit Rundown. What is the single biggest dick move in all of history? Thomas Midgley invented Freon, and putting lead into gasoline. He knew that putting lead into gasoline was a dick move and he did it anyway for money. He knew because he got lead poisoning himself and still lied about its effects on people. Environmental historians have said that he has had the single largest impact on the Earth's atmosphere of any single organism in the history of the planet. Not to mention that lead levels directly correspond to lower cognitive abilities in the general population, and you can look up the dates to know who would have been affected. The Romans used a discipline called decimation, where a military unit was divided up into groups of 10. They'd cast lots and the loser would be beaten to death by the other 9. Having been in the military myself, I can only imagine the nightmares these men would endure the rest of their lives. Crassus used this discipline on his soldiers in the Spartacus uprising, Rome's third servile war, which was a huge dick move. But Crassus wasn't done being a dick. Ever wonder why there wasn't a fourth servile war against Rome? While most of the rebel slaves were killed on the battlefield, some 6,000 survivors were captured by the legions of Crassus. All 6,000 were crucified along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua. The road was lined every 5-6 feet with torture and death. So everyone in the Roman Empire at the time probably lived with that sight for the rest of their lives. Around the formation of the Persian Empire, Herodotus tells the story how King Astyages, the last king of Media, had a dream that his daughter would give birth to a king who would overthrow him. So he orders his general Harpagus to kill the child at birth. Harpagus doesn't want to kill the baby/spill royal blood, so he gives the child, Cyrus, to a shepherd to raise. 10 years later, Cyrus is discovered alive. King Astyages fakes being happy that the kid is alive, suggesting he always regretted issuing that order. To celebrate, he plans a feast and tells Harpagus to send his son over to play with Cyrus. During the banquet, King Astyages has the son of Harpagus killed, cooked, and fed to Harpagus. When the act was revealed, it is said that Harpagus did not react other than to gather the pieces of his son and remove them for burial. Harpagus bides his time. Much later, Cyrus is gathering forces against King Astyages. Astyages orders Harpagus, as his primary general, to lead the army against Cyrus. After a 3-day battle, Harpagus took his revenge for the death of his son by turning on the battlefield in favor of Cyrus, resulting in Astyages' defeat and the formation of the Persian Empire. When the Mexican government rounded up thousands of Yaqui natives, made them walk over 300 kilometers to the coast, put them on boats, and sold them as slaves for about 25 cents. Most ended up on plantations in Veracruz where they were worked to death. Slavery was already illegal in Mexico at the time. Before 1965, the Indonesian government sent academicians, especially STEM graduates, to study in Eastern Europe. After the supposed communist uprising in 30th of September 1965, the government revoked their citizenship and declared them stateless. They risk persecution and possible torture and murder if they insist on returning. These nuclear physicists, master engineer, and PhD graduates take menial jobs, becoming janitors and wait tables to carry on living with virtually no possibility of return to their country. That woman scorned who killed effing everybody. Hang about, I'll Google it. Sonit Olga of Kiev. After her husband, the prince, was tortured and murdered by dissidents, Drevlian, she got vengeance by burying alive the first messengers, boiling alive the second set of messengers, having a funeral feast for her late husband which included Drevlians, and then had 5,000 of them killed. After a year-long siege, Olga said, "Give me 3 pigeons, and 3 sparrows from each house." The Drevlians rejoiced at the prospect of the siege ending for so small a price, and did as she asked. Olga then instructed her army to attach a piece of sulfur bound with small pieces of cloth to each bird. At nightfall, Olga told her soldiers to set the pieces aflame and release the birds. They returned to their nests within the city, which subsequently set the city ablaze. There was not a house that was not consumed, and it was impossible to extinguish the flames, because all the houses caught fire at once. As the people fled the burning city, Olga ordered her soldiers to catch them, killing some of them and giving the others as slaves to her followers. She left the remnant to pay tribute. It's a fine line between total dick move and badass on this one. The original white elephant gifting from the King of Siam. This person would give this royal gift to people he found irritating and be entertained by the recipient's failing efforts to upkeep such an animal. Why don't they just give it away, you ask? Back in the day, receiving a gift and giving it away was perceived as an insult. Go figure. And giving away a gift from a neighboring kingdom is, well, that much bigger of an insult. So, no dice. Economies apparently have failed in order to upkeep a royal gift like this. Honestly, dick move, King of Siam. The Russian army pushing Hitler back across Europe. They get to the outskirts of Warsaw and broadcast in Polish to have all the men in the city join the fight. Cue large uprising. Russia holds back until all the men in the city are killed, so there's nobody left to resist when they occupy, and then resume pushing Hitler back across Europe. A company was then chosen by the battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel John Dutton Frost, to lead the 2nd Parachute Battalion in the Battle of Arnhem, part of Operation Market Garden, because of Digby's reputation of being an aggressive commander. In preparation, Digby, concerned about the unreliability of radios, educated his men on how to use bugle calls that had been used during the Napoleonic Wars for communication in case the radios failed. He also took an umbrella with his kit as a means of identification because he had trouble remembering passwords and felt that anyone who saw him with it would think that only a bloody fool of an Englishman would carry an umbrella into battle. A company was dropped away from the target of Arnhem Bridge and had to go through Arnhem where the streets were blocked by German forces. Digby led his men through the back gardens of nearby houses instead of attempting to advance through the streets and thus avoided the Germans. Digby and A Company managed to travel 8 miles in 7 hours while also taking prisoner 150 German soldiers including members of the SS during the battle. Digby wore his red beret instead of a helmet and waved his umbrella while walking about the defenses despite heavy mortar fire. When the Germans started using tanks to cross the bridge, Digby led a bayonet charge against them wearing a bowler hat. He later disabled a German armored car with his umbrella, incapacitating the driver by shoving the umbrella through the car's observational slit and poking the driver in the eye. Digby then noticed the chaplain pinned down by enemy fire while trying to cross the street to get to injured soldiers. Digby got to him and said, "Don't worry about the bullets, I've got an umbrella." He then escorted the chaplain across the street under his umbrella. When he returned to the front line, one of his fellow officers said about his umbrella that thing won't do you any good, to which Digby replied, "Oh my goodness, Pat, but what if it rains?" Digby was later injured by shrapnel, which also cut open the rear of his trousers but continued to fight until A Company had run out of ammunition. Despite the radios being unreliable as Digby had predicted and the bugle calls being used most in the battle, the message "out of ammo, God save the king" was radioed out before Digby was captured. ISIS and or whatever Muslim or Asian group in power, going through ancient temples and destroying millennia-old statues and works of art simply because they represent a different philosophy. The thought of destroying some 2,000-year-old statue just because I don't believe in their philosophy is beyond criminal to me. It is a crime against all of humanity. I mean, who the fuck are you to think you are so important you can destroy something so valuable? In terms of deaths, several seemingly simple events triggered World War I. That's 40 million deaths that a sandwich sale or an auto mechanic, or even a grandma could have averted. Many world leaders were related, and several said if their grandmother was still alive, she would have put a stop to it before it spread. World War I led to World War II. China's Great Leap Forward had about 30 direct deaths and another 20 or so indirect deaths. On smaller scales, history is littered with betrayal and intrigue. Who knows what treasures were lost, and what discoveries and inventions we don't have because of them? Do we not have flying cars and hoverboards due to some greedy jerk? Was world peace and global lives of ease lost because somebody made a dick move? We may never know. When God told Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, and right when Isaac was begging for his life and his dad was about to drive a knife into his chest, God said, "Psych. I got you good, bro. Kill that ram over there instead." France forcing Haiti to pay reparations for over 100 years until the 1950s for the losses incurred by their colonial slave owners when Haiti declared independence in the 1830s. This crippled their economy, forcing them to waste a century of trade surplus that could have been used to develop their nation. They continue to be one of the poorest countries in the world, and so far, France still has yet to give much back. Denmark's King Christian II, then the leader of the Kalmar Union of Scandinavia, sent out invitations to all his Swedish vassals that were critical of him. "Come to Stockholm," he wrote, "I promise to treat you fairly and not, kill you all. I just want to have a sit down where we can iron out any disagreements. There will be cake." There was no cake. Also, he had them all arrested and charged with treason and heresy. "You promised not to do this. Why are you doing this?" "Ah, but you see, you're heretics." The Pope himself said, "I don't have to honor any promises given to heretics." Gotcha. And then he had them all beheaded. 82 people in 2 days? This is now known as the Stockholm bloodbath. Civil war then broke out, and Christian, being the worst ever leader, went on holiday in Holland with his mother-in-law, and what was left of the Kalmar Union fell apart into the Scandinavia we know today. Christian was eventually overthrown in Denmark and died in prison. In Sweden, Christian is known as Christian the Tyrant today. In Denmark, he's the second. The white American conquest over the native populations is probably a strong contender. A large majority of Native American tribes were quite welcoming of newcomers in need. There's an entire holiday about being thankful for the kindness and the generosity of the Native Americans. In return, they were gifted with smallpox and other lethal diseases, had every one of their treaties ignored, and were wiped out whenever they tried to complain about it, had their primary prey species deliberately hunted to extinction, had their culture reduced to primitive shamanism and a few totemic symbols, and those that weren't killed outright were forcibly marched across the continent to poorer land in an even known as the effing Trail of Tears. Vlad the Impaler, aka Vlad III or just Vlad Dracula, was pretty much a medieval war crime machine for the sake of psychological warfare against the Ottoman Turks, to help overcome his army's manpower deficit compared to his enemies. Everyone knows about the impaling of his enemies, and sometimes just civilians to prove his point, but he also impaled people at dinners and dipped his bread in their blood while eating. He'd cut open women who were allegedly pregnant from himself to prove they were not. Executed thousands of his own loyal people during his reign for the simple fact they were not of his faith. How did Vlad solve the massive poor vagabonds issue in his country? Set up lavish meals for the poor, as they ate and drank into the night, secretly locked the door and burned down the wooden halls. As stated, before he was notorious for impaling anyone for anything, so why did people keep showing up? If you didn't, you guessed it, impaled on the spot. Might as well risk a meal with the very slim chance you might live. When Vlad paid his final tribute to Mehmed the Conqueror's diplomats, Vlad demanded they remove their turbans as a sign of respect. They did not, protesting religious customs, as in the Ottoman Empire you could mostly practice your religion peacefully if your country was occupied and as long as you paid yearly tribute. Expecting Vlad to obey the same rules as they did. Vlad did not care and had their turbans nailed to their head. Also proceeded to dress up as Ottoman soldiers and janissaries to slaughter Ottoman civilians to sow distrust. When Ottoman armies began flowing over his border, he followed a scorched earth policy, likely the example Stalin followed in World War II. Burned down entire villages, destroyed anything that could be of value, poisoned wells. Dumped massive amounts of human waste and infectious corpses in all large bodies of fresh water and any fields left untouched, so Ottomans had literally nothing to scavenge. Shin A. Lam competed at the 2012 Summer Olympics in the women's épée, fencing, in both the individual and team event. In the semi-finals of women's individual épée, she lost to German Britta Heidmann after a timekeeping error extended bout time. The situation arose at the end of the 1-minute overtime, sudden death, with the match tied 5-5. Without the extension, Shin would have won the tied bout on the basis of priority, which is randomly awarded to one fencer prior to the overtime period. With 1 whole second showing on the official clock, Heidmann made 2 rapid attacks in succession, both halted by double touches. The clock in the arena continued to show 0:01, because it could not display decimal fractions of a second. The referee then called halt to the bout. At this point, the timekeeper, a games volunteer, restarted the clock, inadvertently expiring all the remaining time, reportedly 0.02 seconds. This action caused the arena clock to show 0 o'clock, giving Shin reason to celebrate. However, the error was noted, and since an overtime minute had to be fenced in its entirety, the referee applied FI Rule T.32-3, which states that in the event of a failure of the clock or an error by the timekeeper, the referee must estimate how much time is left. The timekeeper, with the referee's permission, reset the clock to show 0:01, 1 whole second being the minimum unit of time possible. Following the resumption of the bout, Heidmann scored a single touch just as the full second expired. The result was partly due to the failure of the referee to stop both fencers restarting closer than the specified distance, Heidmann's crowding to hurry her attack, and Shin trying to avoid retreating across her end line. The South Koreans immediately appealed the decision, stating that 0.02s had already elapsed and the final touch occurred after the end of the bout. In accordance with fencing bylaws, Shin could not leave the piste while the officials deliberated the situation. Sobbing profusely, she sat alone for over an hour awaiting their decision. Ultimately, the judges gave the victory to Heidmann. The Piet Retief Delegation Massacre in 1838. White settlers in South Africa began talks with a Zulu king named Dingane to find a peaceful resolution to an ongoing conflict over land, and after treaties were signed and gestures of goodwill were employed to ease tensions, the king invited the Voortrekker leader, Piet Retief, and a delegation of 100 men to witness a special performance that would have seen the two sides further relax hostilities. Once their guard was down, Dingane betrayed and murdered the entire delegation including women, children, and Retief's sons, saving Retief himself for last so he could witness the slaughter of everyone he brought with him. The whole process of colonization in Canada. In Canada, we strong-armed treaties with First Nations that relocated nomadic populations into another area, and forced them to be agrarian while not even teaching them how to farm, and stopping food subsidies due to pressure from the general population. Many starved. Their motto was feed one day, starve the next. We also took their children away and placed them in residential schools where they were abused, mentally, physically, in any way possible generally, separated from their families, was not allowed to see family, and washed out of their culture. The last residential school to close in Canada was in 1996. That time during British weapons testing in Australia when they made one of the bombs a dirty bomb by salting it with cobalt, without telling any of the people on the ground what they did. The extremely radioactive cobalt-60 pellets were discovered by accident by scientists on the ground, many of who received dangerous levels of radiation which would affect their health for the rest of their lives. Local indigenous populations and servicemen drafted for the cleanup were also exposed to radiation, the effects of which were exacerbated by the secrecy of the testing and the British government balking at paying compensation for fear of setting a precedent. The Australian government has also failed to compensate most servicemen who were exposed to the radiation, despite many of them dying in their 50s and proof being found that soldiers were deliberately exposed to radiation by being sent through affected areas immediately after nuclear blasts as part of human experimentation. Radioactive material remains buried in trenches at the site, and barely anyone seems to know about how much the British screwed over Australians during the nuclear testing on Australian soil. Thanks for listening to Reddit Rundown. Give a thumbs up and subscribe, and help me get to 1,000 subs. Leave a comment below on what kind of topics or stories you would like to hear. You can also check out other videos on my channel. Thanks and have an awesome day.